Hello, my name is Stefania Romaniuk, and I'm thrilled to be guest hosting the Opera Glasses podcast. Today, I will be joined by Dan Scholsberg, the wonderful composer who has arranged a new adaptation of Poul opera of The Handmaid's Tale, which will be performed at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity this summer. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute honor to be sitting beside you and to be discussing The Handmaid's Tale. Let's start with an obvious question. Since the opera premiered in 2000, it's been performed across the world. It was even nominated for a couple of Grammys. And yet, this upcoming performance is billed as a workshop performance. So could you talk a little bit about what exactly is being workshopped?
Absolutely. So I am in the process and actually mostly done with creating a new arrangement of the piece. So originally Poul, the wonderful composer, wrote it for a huge orchestra. So that would mean like 3 winds per part, like 3 flutes, 3 clarinets, etc. So it's a really huge amount of brass, massive string section, just like a full orchestra. And I think it was originally perhaps Joel Ivany and Chris Lorway who kind of hatched a plan to create a new version of it, being an iconic piece of Canadian literature and also being a really wonderful opera. I mean, Poul set the novel pretty straight on. Story is obviously so compelling and important. So I think they were really interested in sharing this piece under the, we're in 2024. We don't always have access to that type of orchestra anymore for many reasons. And so I think they were just really interested in hearing this piece in a more condensed setting. And so I, spent the last few months working on a new arrangement for 16 players. Mm-hmm. So that meant, and I was in touch with Joel throughout the year, figuring out what actually the orchestration would be. I've done this for many different pieces. I have an opera company in New York, which I do, called Heartbeat, and for the past 10 years I've spent doing like radical reorchestrations of classic works for very small amount of players. So when approaching this piece, it's a little bigger ensemble than I've often worked with, and it's also a more contemporary piece. So there's different considerations that have come into play as I've worked on it. But when I picked the ensemble, I wanted to try to honor Poul's color. Like it's an amazing piece. It's like he runs the gamut of styles, sounds, really pulling out as many colors from the orchestra as he can. And so I wanted to honor that. And so I started with a chamber orchestra. I knew that, we're going to have winds of some kind. And, I decided in this piece that we're going to need a flute and a piccolo, so the flutist will switch off because the high register is really important in this piece. So piccolo is really, really important. Oboe also, there's some English horn, which provides a really darker color. And then usually you would have clarinet and then bassoon, but instead of bassoon, I felt like this piece that color wasn't as important in this piece, and so I actually have 2 clarinets. And so one of them is just playing a normal B-flat clarinet, and the other one doubles on bass. And so for me, the bass clarinet it opens a lot of color option in the low register. So that's 4, and for brass, horn, trumpet, trombone felt it was just kind of the classic setup because I knew that we really needed some of the lower color, and trombone would give that to us. And then strings, so what I decided in this case was like normal string quartet and bass. Very important to have the bass there, obviously, because we're in a small ensemble. But because, again, Poul really loves the high violins together in really close proximity. And so generally it would be 2 violins, viola, cello. But for me, I was like, okay, I really need a lot of high sound at certain moments. And so I actually asked the violist to double violin as well. And so the string quintet either is 3 violins, cello, bass, or 2 violins, viola, cello, and bass. And then the other challenge was percussion and keyboards. Percussion originally was, I think, 4 or 5 even percussion. And so I did not have the personnel for that in this. And so I was like, what is the minimum that I really can use? And so I decided 2. I would have 2 percussionists, and they're really going crazy. And one of the things that you'll see in this is that they're just jumping around from instrument to instrument all the time. And I really ask a lot of them. They're like often playing 2 instruments at once, with one hand playing one hand playing the other. For example, chimes are an important sound in this piece. And so I ask, I think, percussion 2 to both play chimes and timpani. So she's like playing timpani with one hand and chimes with the other, and then has to like switch quickly to play bass drum. So it's all kinds of craziness. But percussion is such, and especially in a small ensemble like this, percussion is like crucial to round out the sound and make it sound like big and everything. And so then the remaining challenge was the keyboards. Originally, there were 3. There's an organ, there's a piano, and then there's a sampler that plays not only like electric piano sounds and vibraphone, but also like sampled, bowed cymbals and sampled like all like crazy didgeridoo. There's a didgeridoo sample that the keyboard plays. So I had to kind of figure, and then there's a harp. So like there are basically 4 keyboard instruments in Poul's original orchestration that I had to figure out how to deal with. And so the way that for me is the easiest is to just put all of that into 2 different keyboard parts. The harp gets put in the keyboard. It's all like samples and synthesizers. And I felt like that was appropriate given the fact that Poul had originally written a sampler part into his orchestration. So I was just like, you know what? We're just going to use his sounds that he already used, plus just like we won't have a harpist, unfortunately. We'll just put the harp in the keyboard, but it just makes it a lot more versatile so that the keyboards can be doing any number of things. Sometimes they play like, they augment the bass part. Like there's supposed to be 4 or 5 like basses playing solo at some point, and like we only have 1, so the keyboard goes down and kind of augments that sound. But that's how I ended up on this ensemble. So in this workshop, to like circle back to your original question, which I've now spent like 10 minutes talking about, in this workshop you're going to hear basically all of Act 1 of this new instrumentation, as well as 1 scene from Act 2. And the other challenge that we face in creating a small version of this piece is dealing with the cast, which is huge, and the chorus, which, is non-existent in our version. And so this workshop, in a more, if we had a little more time, we would have dealt with the chorus for this workshop. But that will have to be for the premiere. Like the chorus, we're kind of figuring out a few different solutions for, whether it's pre-recorded or offstage, or using the people we have in our ensemble to fill out the sound, which in this workshop, you're going to hear that. Like you'll hear the full cast, who are all soloists, kind of act as the chorus in this workshop, which is a really important part of this piece. Anyone who knows the story knows that like seeing the kind of mass of handmaids is a major like element of this, and so that's part of creating this whole new version.
So in addition to those challenges, obviously you have the challenge of time. There's been 2 weeks, and I believe that you weren't even here for the first several days.
Moonlighting is my other opera. I'm the head of an opera company going to this opera conference.
So in fact, to put together even just a single act and a little bit of the second act, to squish that into 2 weeks, that's a huge feat, especially with, even if it is reduced forces. What were some of the things that have been unexpected in this rehearsal process, or even in general in the creative process, that you didn't anticipate before it actually started?
It all comes down to how to achieve the music that Poul wrote with the amount of people we have. And I think as we started to look at what actually would be involved with, okay, if we're gonna have to substitute the chorus with a recording of a chorus, that means that you have to have a full recording session where everyone is there singing, and when there's a chorus, they can't always, they need to figure out, they need to get their pitches somehow, and they also need to be like, so there's also a challenge of like, well, there's a full chorus, and so they're either going to need, each of them is going to need an in-ear monitor so that if there's a keyboard is playing something, that they can hear their pitches, but that we don't want to end up in the actual recording. And so that was a major challenge. And so we ultimately were like, okay, that's not for this year. That's it's gonna have to happen in advance of the premiere whenever that occurs. So that was one thing. And then in this workshop, you'll hear, we did make some recordings. There's some moments where the chorus has like little solos when they're at the market and they're ordering eggs and whatever. And so you hear that, and we actually recorded in our individual soloists singing those lines. And then our amazing keyboard programmer Henry Ng put that into the keyboard parts. And at one point, one of the keyboardists plays notes that I've assigned, but instead of hearing pitches, you hear the recordings of these soloists. And so that's an element that we wanted to try in this new version of the piece that will then translate to other moments as well. But you'll hear that here. You'll also hear some sound effects that we've put into the keyboards. And when you have keyboards at your disposal, especially two, one is difficult because one, you are only limited to two hands. When you have four hands at work and you're able to like assign different sounds to different registers at the same time, like at any one point I could have a vibraphone playing with the right hand and have samples of people saying something with the left hand. And so it really, and when you have four of that really opens up you can really do as many things as you want. I love using it because our options just become so much bigger in terms of pre-recording sounds, vocals, recordings of choruses, and sound effects. All of that can just happen within the confines of the keyboards. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that we've started to explore in this workshop. And I guess we're probably hoping to do a bit more, but again, the confines of time. It's like we only have so much time to record and to rehearse, and our keyboard programmer only has so much time to do all of this. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is sound. So in this particular workshop that you will see, the particularities of the space that we're in, which is really beautiful theater, we don't have access to the pit this year. So that means that the orchestra's on stage. And because of the sound setup, there's no room in front of the orchestra to have the singers. So we had to put the singers up in back. And so that presents a whole variety of sound challenges. We have an amazing sound team working on it. But what that means is have to deal with amplification in a way that we did not anticipate. Although this piece also has these really extended flashback scenes, which was another thing that we were in the next version, we would pre-record all of those as well and have projections work. But for this, we just didn't have time. So for this version, we have microphones there for the singers. And for the flashback scenes, we're actually putting a bit of reverb on to kind of denote that they are separate and that they're in the past. But because of the size of the band is 16, but it's full, it's brass instruments, it's wind instruments, and they're playing right in front of the singers. And so we are figuring out how best to balance that and kind of using some sleight of hand sound tricks to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like there's so many things. So many things to keep track of.
It's making an opera, making an opera involves every department. So you always need to think about 5 zillion things at once.
And on top of that, this is a work by a living composer. Correct. So because you're arranging someone else's work, how much creative freedom have you had in your own arrangements?
Great question. When I've done arrangements of classic operas in the past, I really take a lot of liberties, and I change the music sometimes completely. I change it to be almost unrecognizable in terms of the orchestration. But in this case, I really am sticking to what Poul has given us on the page in terms of color, because he's a brilliant orchestrator, he's a brilliant composer, and I would think that my goal here is to kind of enhance and essentialize what he's done rather than kind of add. People who look at this, you could maybe find my own personal stamp on it if you tried, and it's not something I consciously put in. I have proclivities, when I choose what to assign to what, I think that I tend to have certain choices, even in not taking out a bassoon, for example, or having the viola's double violin. That's more of my own, way that I like to orchestrate. But in general, I hope that we'll hear, a really beautiful version of what he wrote that, is a little more... it's having a chamber ensemble is different. It's it's vivacious and maybe more, and it has a lot of clarity in a way that a full orchestra is just there for a different reason. Mm-hmm. And so I really enjoy that. Having solo strings is really interesting in this piece. It's like a group of soloists rather than an orchestra, and so that affects the way that I write it. But I would say that I'm really trying to bring his music to life, mostly. Mm-hmm.
And I've had a chance to sit in on a few of the rehearsals, and yes. the texture is, I personally find it very evocative of the world of The Handmaid's Tale. And so I think like for readers who are familiar with the novel or people who have seen the TV show, they might be familiar with the fact that this is like a futuristic, dystopian sort of society. Democracy has deteriorated into really religious authoritarianism.
I don't relate to that at all. Where I'm from, down south of the border.
There's, I mean, that's maybe a different podcast. But it's, we kind of see this like alternate universe, and you really do feel the sense of that unease through the music. What was part of your preparation process for understanding the world of The Handmaid's Tale, and how you wanted to bring it to life through the orchestration?
I am very familiar with the book. I actually read it for the first time just a few years ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. I mean, I think in the context of what's happening today, it's just there. It's always resonating. The TV series I'm not as familiar with. I've seen a few episodes, but I think once I started on this project, I consciously did not watch all of that because I'm sure it's amazing. It's slightly different, I think, than the book. It kind of goes off in certain directions. I agree. I think that the sound world that Poul has created is really strong, and it really reflects the action on stage, and it's just it kind of pulls you in all these directions, and the way that he stacks tonalities, tonality is there, and that's what makes me personally interested in it, particularly in the score. I think if it were completely atonal and opaque, I wouldn't feel as strong of a connection to it. But it's there, and I think that's reflecting what you said in terms of we're in this world, but slightly off. We're in a somewhat recognizable world, but it's also just bizarre. And the sounds that are created from this band and the keyboards and the synthesizers are just a little strange and a little off and a little intense, and it's it has this element of ritual, and there are these it's this religious authoritarian state, and they've co-opted the Bible for purposes of ceremonial rape to say that's what's happening in this, and taking children away from women and all this stuff. So I think the score captures that kind of mangled version of religion in a really interesting way. The percussion and the way that the Latin, there's a lot of Latin in this, and the way that that's set in this the quasi-religious choral music. I tried to retain that as much as I could, and the gongs and the drum, the bass drum is a really important element of this, and the tam-tam, which is this big resonant gong, and so I tried to preserve all of that and keep that in mind as I orchestrated.
I guess this is going to be our last question.
Sure.
And as workshop performances typically go, it's not fully staged. This particular one, as you mentioned, it's missing most of Act 2 and some other sections. What role does the audience play in this kind of a performance, perhaps through independent learning or their engagement as listeners, or the use of the imagination? And how would you encourage listeners to make the most of their experience?
The audience for me is so important. So important in any piece of music. I always say that there's the composer / arranger in this case, the performers who make it, and the audience who listens to it. And that those three elements, without one of those, impossible. So for me, the audience, I'm very curious, very, very curious what an audience will think of this. It's not fully staged. It's not we have Amanda's Tessini is doing a gorgeous job of shading. The singers are all standing up, in the back. There's going to be, people turn one way or the other. They kind of simulate certain scenes, and there's some projections, and there's obviously super titles as well. But I think the piece is very powerful even without that. And I think even in this kind of bare form, just listening to the music of it and watching and seeing the plot unfold, I think people will be affected by it. I'm just very curious as to how. And I'm curious, how it comes across in this setting. I would encourage people to take it in, just let it wash over, and just, I'm not sure how many people in the audience will have heard this piece before. It hasn't been performed too much. I think now it's getting more performances, and I think this is a really wonderful time to try out a new version of it. Again, the story is just beneath the surface for everyone at the moment. Speaking for myself, listening to the music, taking the story, and seeing how we have a beautiful opportunity to see the full orchestra on stage. And I think it's virtuosic. All of these instrumentalists are playing parts that were meant for either multiple versions of themselves or like a whole section. And so seeing soloists play this music, really demanding music, and seeing the singers, I mean, they've prepared it so incredibly well, and they sound really amazing. And I think seeing people do this piece without the kind of like, you know, you're just distracted by, not distracted, but you're like enamored with a certain staging or like whatever, just seeing the piece as is, I think will be very interesting. And I think will be effective, hopefully. And
so good news, bad news, the performance is sold out at the Banff Centre, so if you don't have your tickets, unfortunately, you'll have missed it this year.
I heard that the hockey game, watching a certain team win or lose that day, may have, there might be some more tickets. So possible that it's that's what I heard yesterday. But if it unfortunately still says sold out on the website, there will be more opportunities to catch this piece in the future, for sure.
Do you have any hints on when that might come up?
Banff is hoping, as far as I know, is hoping to produce it either next season or the following. And I know there's a lot of interest in this from outside people that might partner with Banff. But no date has been set, but I think everyone's keen to do the full. Now that the orchestra pit in the theater actually is functional, I think everyone's very keen to do it quickly. So I'm excited about that.
Well, I absolutely cannot wait to see this performance, and just wish you all the very best, and a huge toi 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 on Saturday.
Thank you so much.